Okay, let's just dive right into this. I want you to think back to when you were a teenager, sitting in a classroom, or maybe you were at the dinner table. You let a piece of slang slip out, or worse, an actual swear word, and immediately an adult scolded you, right? Watch your language, they said. Speak properly. I mean, we literally all have that highly relatable memory of being reprimanded for using so-called bad language. But what if the language we were always told was a sign of a lazy mind is actually governed by a highly complex, invisible set of social rules? Well, today in this explainer, we're going to uncover the hidden sociolinguistics behind the very words you aren't supposed to say. And that brings us to a rather provocative question that we really need to challenge ourselves with right out of the gate here. Is there a place for bad words in school? Now, I know your immediate instinct is probably a resounding absolutely not. We naturally assume that educational settings are strictly reserved for what we call proper or standard English. But as we dig into the research today, specifically we're pulling from this fascinating Swedish degree thesis on ninth grade ESL students, along with a really compelling paper from the TESOL Canada Journal, we are going to completely challenge that assumption. We need to reconsider what constitutes true language mastery in the real world. So, to understand this shift, we first kind of have to acknowledge the universal stigma we were all taught. The traditional view, which is heavily documented in linguistic research, has basically always been that slang, cursing, and taboo words are merely vulgar signs of an uneducated mind. The idea is that resorting to this language represents an innate inarticulation, like an inability to use standard language. But as linguistic scholars like Green point out, that is simply not true. Slang actually remains in this state of constant creative reinvention, even if that reinvention isn't coming from elite academic sources. To ground this in actual linguistic science, let's look at how academia clinically defines the language of the streets. A vulgarism is defined as crude or raw expressions from the streets used to debase or devalue a thing or individual. It's a wonderfully sterile, academic way to describe highly offensive street language, isn't it? But see, beneath this totally clinical definition lies a massive amount of social weight. The words themselves might be crude, sure, but the decision of exactly when, where, and how to use them is incredibly calculated. Now, notice the absolutely crucial difference between what a word literally means and how it actually feels. Look at the denotation versus connotation here. You could say, this shirt is made of poor quality material. It's polite, it's clean. But compare it to its taboo equivalent, this shirt is made of shitty material. Lexically, the meaning is exactly the same, but connotatively, the emotional weight, the casualness, the specific signaling to the listener, it is a whole different ballgame. Native speakers know exactly how much is lost in translation when you sanitize language. Moving on to part 1, the hidden rules of swearing. To really unpack these hidden rules, we turn to the fascinating arguments of ESL researcher Robin Elise Mercury. She makes this compelling case that swearing isn't just random chaos. In fact, she points out something absolutely brilliant. She writes, those who swear successfully are usually mindful of the social restrictions placed on them in most situations. Now, think about that exact phrase for a second. Swear successfully. Native speakers are constantly performing this complex mental calculus. They evaluate their listeners to avoid negative character judgments. If you use a taboo word and your audience is offended, well, you've failed socially. You've totally misread the room. Successful swearers are actually master readers of their social environments. Let's break down those rules of discretion. It really comes down to 3 things: evaluating the listener's status, deeply understanding the difference between public and private domains, and ensuring you're in a safe environment among friends where your social status isn't at risk. Let me ask you a provocative question just to test your own discretion here. Would you ever use the same words with your doctor, sitting in a sterile examination room, that you freely use with your best friends hanging out at the local pub? Of course not. You intuitively know the rules. Which brings us to part 2, slang and the gender divide. So these rules of discretion aren't just about who we're talking to. They are deeply tied to who we actually are. This is brilliantly illustrated by observational data from a degree thesis out of Halmstad University, which looked at 15 and 16-year-old Swedish students learning English. Look at exactly where they use slang and taboo words. 68.4% of the time, it happens in small group discussions. 26.3% in between activities. But during whole class discussions where the teacher is actively involved and listening, it plummets to just 5.3%. Even 15-year-olds instinctively know the rules of public versus private settings inside a single classroom. They know exactly when they're safe. Now, the crucial point is how this data splits when we look at gender norms. Researchers note that male speakers often use taboo language to assert dominance and boldly signal group membership, using it across both public and private settings. Female speakers, conversely, are sociolinguistically conditioned to sustain group harmony. They tend to highly adapt to their specific social setting, often restricting taboo language strictly to private spheres and completely avoiding it in mixed or public company. It just shows us that slang isn't just vocabulary, it's a social tool that gets used totally differently depending on our cultural conditioning. Ultimately, slang serves as this incredibly powerful identity marker. Applying Turner's self-categorization theory, we see that youths playfully use slang to really cement their social identities. It enhances bonds within their group and creates these very distinct boundaries from the outgroups, like adults or teachers. During those Swedish classroom observations, researchers recorded students freely inventing and using words like abow, speaky speaky, or surrey. It acts as this dynamic youth counter language. It's essentially a way to claim ownership over the English they're learning. Let's pivot into part 3, a new classroom paradigm. Okay, so if teenagers are instinctively performing these high-level sociolinguistic adaptations, creating complex in-group boundaries, and flawlessly navigating public versus private domains, shouldn't we be talking about this in schools? Synthesizing all this research points to a massive classroom paradigm shift. Let's look through the eyes of the actual educators on the ground. The research from Halmstad University involved interviewing Swedish 9th grade ESL teachers who are literally in the trenches every single day. They are the ones dealing with a constant influx of informal slang and various English expletives. I mean, they hear the F word, they hear shit, they hear this crazy blend of internet slang and cultural markers constantly. And their perspective on this is incredibly revealing. One teacher noted, a lot of it is influenced by social media and TV and series, and this affects how well they write. Guys, this is the undeniable reality. Students are absorbing this casual, often taboo language everywhere. It is completely impossible for modern educators to just put their hands over their ears and pretend it doesn't exist. It's infiltrating their spoken English and their written assignments. The language is already in the room. And this is exactly where Robin Elise Mercury champions a massive paradigm shift. She argues, learners need to understand what constitutes obscene language and what it signifies sociolinguistically. Now, let's be very clear about this. This isn't about teaching kids how to swear, not at all. It's about teaching them the etiquette of taboo words. If they hear these words in movies or on the streets, they need a safe, mature environment to understand exactly what using that word signifies to a native speaker. It's about helping them achieve true, nuanced fluency. Let's look at how this builds into real, concrete benefits for the classroom. By shifting the focus from just keeping kids proper to making them masters of social adaptation, teachers can actually teach complex linguistic registers. You empower students to understand situational adaptation, knowing exactly why a word kills it at a party but completely tanks a job interview. You deconstruct cultural nuances safely, and frankly, you create a relatable, highly engaging learning environment because you are actually validating the real-world English they consume every single day. So we end up right back where we started, but hopefully with a completely new perspective. Are we failing students by keeping language too clean? Because if we only teach textbook English, we send learners out into a messy, complex world, completely blind to the hidden social rules of real human communication. Maybe it's time we stop just scolding the slang and start explaining the incredible sociolinguistic machinery running behind it. Think about that the next time a bad word slips out.